Mi fambolde unakushe. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. All protocols observed. Thank you so much for this opportunity. My name is Daphne Isatotholi. I'm a civil engineer from Sierra Leone, and currently I'm an Alexander von Humboldt International Climate Protection Fellow for 2025-2026. I'm also the co-founder of an early stage company, Dave T Solutions, and we're developing climate resilient infrastructure and technology solutions for cities and communities. Today, I'll be sharing reflections on climate resilient infrastructure in African cities, drawing on experiences from Freetown and from my research as well. In my city, Freetown, climate change is not an abstract conversation. It is something we experience every day. It shows up when intense rainfall floods homes, that's built around drainage channels or along riverbanks or the seaside. It shows up when rising temperature makes dense settlement unbearable during the dry season. And it also shows up when families choose between unsafe water sources and walking long distances to access safe water. These are not separate. A climate challenge is an infrastructure challenge and a financing challenge. They're failures of infrastructure and they deeply connected to health, to dignity, and economic opportunity. So we thinking the different sectors in today's program: energy power systems, health, systems protect people. Agriculture feeds nations, but then none of them function without resilient infrastructure and financing the richest communities. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'll be referring to informal settlements as underserved urban settlements and the informal sector as the local economic sector. Across sub-Saharan Africa, 53% of urban population live in underserved urban communities. And in Freetown, it's about 60% that live in these communities. So these are communities where infrastructure has not kept pace. It hasn't caught up with urban growth. I see our problem less of a people issue and more of a systems issue that need investment. So mostly in our settlements, housing, we call it Pambodi, it's self-built, and most of these settlements are along the coast or hillside. And people mostly use the zinc sheets to do them. So from our heat vulnerability mapping done during my research, it shows that heat exposure overlaps with economic activity. So the areas most exposed to heat often overlap with areas where people earn their living through small-scale trading and outdoor work. And I think this is what capital is not seeing. According to 2021 UNCDF research, 86% of Sierra Leone's labor force works in the local economic sector, and mostly in petty trading and agriculture. And our local economic sector is climate vulnerable. So thinking the financing gap, according to AU and African Development Bank, our continent has an annual financing gap of between 670 billion and $848 billion US dollars, despite the fact that to meet the end SDGs alone by 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, we're projected to need up to 1.67 trillion US dollars annually. As a continent, we also need 234 billion to 250 billion dollars to finance climate action. And so, despite being a continent that is vulnerable to the effects of climate change, Africa's share in the global climate finance remains very small due to misalignment and donor-centered climate finance architecture. And out of the 652.6 billion of the global climate finance mobilized in 2019-2020, Africa only received about 4.5% of that. And that's just $29.5 billion. And 86% of this is from public sources and 14% from private sources. We also receive around, so it shows that we receive between 3 to 4.5% of the global climate finance flows. Imagine as a continent. And when you come down to national level, Sierra Leone's NDC did a great job in estimating the financial roadmap that takes to implement climate mitigation and adaptation actions between 2025 and 2035. And so we'll need approximately $2.97 billion to do that. However, the financing gap exists from global to local level, and there are challenges like unstable financial flows, fluctuations in foreign investment, challenges in attracting investment for implementation, and also the debt burden we have as African countries. Yet, only a very small share of this actually trickles down to the local level where you have implementation and infrastructure that actually built. So it also brings to mind the question, what part of this budget is dedicated to gender responsive budgeting? Our funding constraints keep us in a cycle of reaction rather than prevention. So, as a civil engineer and from my research, for me, climate resilient infrastructure cannot be viewed only as an engineering challenge or an infrastructure challenge. It is also a gender and social design challenge. So, when we design climate projects, a gender responsive approach for me is needed where we know the realities and we actively take steps to respond to these realities. And certain questions are good to ask, like who participates in planning and decision making, who bears the care work, unpaid care work along local labor, who controls resources and land, who benefits economically from these investments, and also what monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems are in place for feedback and constant reiteration. So, from gender experts I've talked to, they state that, and I do agree with this, gender integration starts early at the design stage and it shouldn't just be an add on. And participation without power and leadership, it doesn't work. And there also needs to be like economic and financial access and sustainable systems through like cooperatives, because locally cooperatives are really key in different African countries. So projects that ignore realities, they lose community ownership. There is also need for meaningful participation, and a space like this, I hope, fosters that. So my question for the Africa's leadership represented here today is that how can Africa create financing mechanisms that enable cities, districts, local communities to access capital directly for climate resilient infrastructure? And also, how can we raise up these funds, increase the funds from our private sources, so that our actions are less reactive and more preventive? Because if solutions exist locally and they're owned locally, the financing systems should be able to scale them, should be available to scale them. Thank you.